Moving over to the letter B for every Major League Baseball player, starting with their last name with the letter B. Charlie Babb, Bob Babcock, Lauren Babe, Johnny Babbage, Charlie Babington, Shooty Babbitt, Lake Bacher, Sam Bachman, Brandon Bach, Les Bachman, Wally Bachman, Eddie Bacon, Mike Bassick, Dakota Bike is Fred Bezecki, Akil Badu, Berg Badenhop, Art Bader, Harrison Bader, Laura Bader, Red Bagro, Ji Juan Bay, Ed Baked, Shaw Swung Bake, Carlos Begra, Rudy Bayrard, Benito Baez, Donnie Baez, Javier Baez, Jose Baez, Julio Baez, Kevin Baez, Michael Baez, Pedro Baez, Sandy Baez, Bagby, Jim Bagby, Ed Bagley, Gene Bagley, Bill Bagwell, Jeff Bagwell, Stan Basham, Ed Barr, Frank Bayard, Grover Bakley, Scott Bales, Bailey, Abraham Bailey, Alonza Bailey, Andrew Bailey, Bill Bailey, Bob Bailey, Brandon Bailey, Corey Bailey, Ed Bailey, Fred Bailey, Gene Bailey, Harvey Bailey, Homer Bailey, Howard Bailey, Jeff Bailey, Jim Bailey, King Bailey, Mark Bailey, Patrick Bailey, Parsi Bailey, Roger Bailey, Steve Bailey, Bob Baylor, Lauren Rain, Harold Baines, Doug Bear, Baird, L. Bart, Bob Bart, Doug Bart, Jeff Baisley, Jeff Bajinaru, and Dave Baconhaster, Al Baker, Bill Baker, Brian Baker, Charles Baker, Charlie Baker, Chuck Baker, Darren Baker, Dave Baker, Del Baker, Doug Baker, Dusty Baker, Edgar Baker, Ernie Baker, Floyd Baker, Frank Baker, Gene Baker, George Baker, Henry Baker, Home Run Baker, Howard Baker, Jack Baker, Jeff Baker, Jesse Baker, John Baker, Kirkley Baker, Lucan Baker, Neil Baker, Norm Baker, Phil Baker, Rufus Baker, Scott Baker, Steve Baker, Tom Baker, Tracy Baker, Jersey Backley, Paul Bacco, Mike Ballas, John Velez, Jordan Balavic, Steve Balboni, Bobby Balsina, Rocco Baldelli, Alberto Baldonado, Jack Baldwin, Billy Baldwin, Brooks Baldwin, Dave Baldwin, Drake Baldwin, Frank Baldwin, Harry Baldwin, Henry Baldwin, James Baldwin, Jeff Baldwin, Kid Baldwin, Lady Baldwin, Mark Baldwin, Orson Baldwin, Reggie Baldwin, Rick Baldwin, Tiny Baldwin, John Bale, Mike Valenti, Vladimir Valentine, Lee Bales, Colin Balester, Grant Balfour, Art Bale, Jeff Ball, Jim Ball, Neil Ball, Wetter Ball, Jeff Ballard, Pelham Bellinger, Jay Baller, Pedro Ballester, Moises Ballesteros, Mark Ballinger, Win Bailu, Tony Balsamo, George Bamberger, Hal Bamberger, Studs Banker, Dave Bancroft, Anthony Bonda, Chris Bando, Sal Bondo, Jeff Bandy, Eddie Bain, Dick Bainey, Jeff Bannister, Dan Bankhead, Fred Bankhead, Sam Bankhead, Scott Bankhead, Banks, Brian Banks, Ernie Banks, George Banks, Josh Banks, Norman Banks, Tanner Banks, Willie Banks, Bill Banks, and Wes Banks, and Jim Banning, Alan Bannister, Brian Bannister, Floyd Bannister, Jimmy Bannon, Rylan Bannon, Tom Bannon, Jack Banta, Brandon Bance, David Buenelos, Manny Buenelos, Travis Baptist, Caleb Barragar, Rod Barajas, Walter Barbe, Red Barbare, Johnny Barbato, William Barbu, Bub Barty, Dave Barbie, Lamb Barbie, Brian Barber, Charlie Barber, Jesse Barber, Sam Barber, Steve Barber, Turner Barber, Frank Barberich, Bart Barbary, Jim Barbary, Ball Barber, Lorenzo Barcelo, Kurt Barclay, George Barclay, Daniel Bard, Josh Bard, Luke Bard, Brian Barton, Ray Bear, Jesse Barfield, John Barfield, Josh Barfield, Clyde Barfoot, Greg Baker, Addison Barger, Cy Barger, Brian Bark, Al Baker, Barker, Glenn Barker, Kevin Barker, Len Barker, Luke Barker, Marvin Barker, Ray Barker, Richie Barker, Sean Barker, Andy Barker, Brian Barkley, Jeff Barkley, Red Barkley, Sam Barkley, Joe Barlow, Mike Barlow, Scott Barlow, Tom Barlow, Bruce Barnes, Clint Barnes, Babe Bama, Charlie Barnaby, Austin Barnes, Bill Barnes, Bob Barnes, Brendan Barnes, Brian Baines, Barnes, Charlie Barnes, Danny Barnes, Eppie Barnes, Frankie Barnes, Fred Barnes, Harry Barnes, Honey Barnes, Jacob Barnes, Jesse Barnes, John Barnes, Junie Barnes, Larry Barnes, Luke Barnes, Matt Barnes, Red Barnes, Rich Barnes, Ross Barnes, Sam Barnes, Scott Barnes, Skeeter Barnes, Vet Barnes, Virgil Barnes, Jack Bennett, Vic Barnett, Tony Barnett, Darwin Barney, Ed Barney, Rex Barney, Clyde Barnhart, Edgar Barnhart, Les Barnhart, Tucker Barnhart, Vic Barnhart, Dave Barnhill, Herb Barnhill, James Barnhill, George Barnacle, Billy Barney, Ed Barnowski, Chris Barnwell, Bernardo Barreau, Salome Baroja, Steve Barron, Daniel Barone, Dick Barone, Bob Barr, Jim Barr, Scotty Barr, Steve Barr, Carl Barclow, Kuno Barragan, Herman Bronco, Manny Barreda, Luis Barrera, Trace Barrera, Jose Barrero, Franklin Barreto, Allison Barrett, Bill Barrett, Bob Barrett, Dick Barrett, Frank Barrett, Jake Barrett, Jimmy Barrett, John Barrett, Johnny Barrett, Marty Barrett, Michael Barretti, Red Barrett, Tim Barrett, Tommy Barrett, Jamie Barria, Francisco Barrios, Jose Barrios, Manuel Barrios, Jonathan Barrios, Frank Barron, Red Baron, Tony Barron, Jorge Barrosa, Hugh Barrows, Frank Barrows, Ed Barry, Harden Barry, Jack Barry, Jeff Barry, John Barry, Kevin Barry, Rich Barry, Tom Barry, Joey Bart, Kim Mella, Barty, Dick Bartell, Bob Barthelson, Jimmy Bartholomew, John Barthold, Les Bartholomew, Tony Baratrom, Hop Bartet, Jason Bartlett, Bill Bartley, Boyd Bartley, Irv Bartling, Bob Barton, Brian Barton, Derek Barton, Harry Barton, Sean Barton, Vince Barton, Dave Bartosh, Cliff Bartosh, Charlie Bartson, Philip Barzilla, Luis Alexander Bassabe, Olsilif Bassabe, Chris Bassick, Monty Bascal, Ray Basham, Al Bashang, Tyler Bachelor, Walt Bachelor, Eddie Rosinski, Jim Basket, Anthony Bass, Brian Bass, Dick Bass, Doc Bass, John Bass, Kevin Bass, Leroy Bass, Norm Bass, Randy Bass, Charlie Bassett, Pepper Bassett, Chris Bassett, Johnny Bassford, Brady Basso, Antonio Bastardo, Charlie Bastian, Emil Bach, Joe Batchelor, Rich Batchelor, John Bateman, Aaron Bates, Billy Bates, Charlie Bates, Del Bates, Dick Bates, Frank Bates, Hubert Bates, Jason Bates, John Bates, Johnny Bates, Ray Bates, Bill Bates, Miguel Batista, Rafael Batista, Tony Batista, Kevin Batiste, Kim Batiste, Bill Botch, Larry Botham, George Batten, Matthew Batten, Peyton Battenfield, Earl Batty, Joe Ratton, Alan Battle, Howard Battle, Jim Battle, Ray Battle, Rufus Battle, Chris Batten, Matt Batts, Brett Bay, Harry Bachman, Al Bauer, Hank Bauer, Lou Bauer, Rick Bauer, Trevor Bauer, Jake Bowers, Russ Bowers, Justin Bogman, Buddy Bogman, Frank Bauman, Mike Bauman, Patty Bauman, Jim Baumer, George Baumgardner, Ross Baumgardner, Harry Baumgardner, John Baumgardner, Stan Baumgardner, Frank Baumholz, George Bosswine, Ed Bauda, Danny Batista, Felix Bautista, Gerson Batista, Jose Batista, Rafael Batista, Marcelona Bauza, Jim Bakes, Mike Baxter, Moose Baxter, Harry Bay, Jackson Bay, Burley Bear, Dick Bayless, Hank Bayless, Jonathan Bayless, Baylock, Dan Baylor, William Reynard, Bill Bain, Shane Baz, Eduardo Bizzardo, Yorman Bizzardo, Darius Ray, Jack Beach, Brandon Beachy, David Beadle, Giovanni Biel, Bob Biel, Johnny Biel, Walter Bialy, Tommy Beals, Alex Beam, Ernie Beam, TJ Beam, Charlie Beeman, Trey Beeman, Belv Bean, Billy Bean, Coulter Bean, Joe Bean, Billy Bean, Dave Beard, Mike Beard, Ollie Beard, Ralph Beard, Ted Beard, Gene Reardon, Bearden, Gary Bear, Larry Beermuth, Kevin Beers, Chris Beersley, Jeremy Beasley, Lou Beasley, Ed Beaton, Pedro Beato, Jim Beatty, Blaine Beatty, Desmond Beatty, Matt Beatty, Jim Bouchon, Ginger Beaumont, Blake Bevan, Edward Bevans, Johnny Bizza, Buck Butte, Buck Buchanan, Steve Belcher, George Betchel, Boom Boom Beck, Chad Beck, Chris Beck, Clyde Beck, Irv Beck, Frank Beck, Fred Beck, George Beck, Jordan Beck, Rich Beck, Rod Beck, Tristan Beck, Zinn Beck, Henry Beckenford, Beals Becker, Bob Becker, Charlie Becker, Heinz Becker, Joe Becker, Marty Becker, Rich Becker, Glenn Beckett, Josh Beckett, Robbie Beckett, Gordon Beckman, Tim Beckman, Jake Beckley, Jim Beckman, Bill Beckman, Joe Beckwith, John Beckwith, Julio Beckwer, Edward Bedard, Howie Bedell, Gene Bedford, Phil Bedford, Hugh Bediant, Andy Bednar, Dave Bednar, Cam Bedrosian, Steve Bedrosian, Fred Bebe, Matt Beach, Ed Beecher, Roy Beecher, Tyler Beede, Jalen Beeks, Dallas Beeler, Jody Beeler, Andy Bean, Fred Bean, Seth Beer, Clarence Beers, Clayton Beater, Joe Beggs, Jim Begley, Petey Behan, Steve Behel, Rick Behana, Mel Behenny, Hank Bethan, Joe Beagle, Kevin Beern, Austin Bayonero, Ali Bejma, Mark Bellinger, Wayne Bellardi, Kevin Belcher, Tim Belcher, Ira Belden, Skinner Belfield, Mike Belfort, Stan Belinda, Bo Belinsky, Ronald Belisario, Matt Belize, Todd Belize, Jeff Bellevue, Tim Belk, Abe Bell, Bio Bell, Bill Bell, Buddy Bell, Chad Bell, Charlie Bell, Cliff Bell, Cool Papa Bell, David Bell, Derek Bell, Alec Bear, Eric Bell, Fern Bell, Frank Bell, Fred Bell, Gary Bell, George Bell, Gus Bell, Heth Bell, Heath Bell, Herman Bell, Jake Bell, Jay Bell, Jerry Bell, Joe Bell, Josh Bell, Juan Bell, Jude Bell, Kevin Bell, Lefty Bell, Les Bell, Mike Bell, Ralph Bell, Rob Bell, Terry Bell, Trevor Bell, W. Bell, William Bell, Zeke Bella, Steve Beltran, Andrew Bellotti, Albert Bell, Mark Bellhorn, Raphael Belliard, Ronnie Belliard, Kelly Bellinger, Cody Bellinger, Jack Bethan, Brian Bello, Rob Bellior, Edward Bellerin, Volante Bellozo, Vince Belnome, Dwayne Bello, Brandon Belt, Carlos Beltran, Francis Beltran, Rijo Beltran, Adrian Beltre, Engel Beltre, Estebel Beltre, Omar Beltre, Anthony Bemboon, Harry Bemis, Marvin Bernard, Freddie Benavides, Johnny Bench, Anthony Bender, Charles Bender, Art Benedict, Bruce Benedict, Alan Baines, Andy Baines, Joe Baines, Ray Bengi, Benny Bengo, Andrew Benatendi, Juan Beniquez, Armando Benitez, Yamil Benitez, Jerry Benjamin, Mike Benjamin, Stan Benjamin, Wes Benjamin, Henry Ben, Ike Benners, Bennett, Bradford Bennett, Bugs Bennett, Charlie Bennett, Dave Bennett, Dennis Bennett, Don Bennett, Eric Bennett, Frank Bennett, Fred Bennett, Gary Bennett, Herschel Bennett, Jeff Bennett, Jimmy Bennett, Joe Bennett, Joel Bennett, Pug Bennett, Sam Bennett, Shane Bennett, George Bennett, Joaquin Benoit, Alan Benson, Cleo Benson, Gene Benson, Joe Benson, Chris Benson, Vern Benson, Will Benson, Cy Bentley, Jack Bentley, Al Benton, Butch Benton, Larry Benton, Rabbit Benton, Rube Benton, Sid Benton, Chad Bentz, Joe Benz, Tony Bent, Todd Benzinger, Joe Baronita, Lou Barrett, Jeff Berblinger, Jason Beret, Juan Berenguer, Bruce Barinal, James Beresford, Dave Berg, Justin Berg, Mo Berg, Augie Bergamo, Bill Bergen, Marty Bergen, Travis Bergen, Rose Berger, Brandon Berger, Clarence Berger, Hayne Berger, Joe Berger, Johnny Berger, Ton Berger, Wally Berger, Peter Berger, Ryan Berger, Brad Bergerson, John Burke, Marty Berghammer, Al Bergman, Christian Bergman, Dave Bergman, Dusty Bergman, Sean Bergman, Jason Bergman, William Bergoglio, Frank Bergelbach, Jason Bergen, Nate Bergenstock, Lance Berkman, Jack Burley, Bob Berman, Jonathan Bermudez, Roger Bernardina, Placo Bernal, Victor Bernal, Kurt Bernard, Dwight Bernard, Joe Bernard, Winston Bernard, Brendan Bernardino, Tony Bernazard, Adam Moreno, Bill Bernhard, Julian Bernhardt, Walter Bernhardt, Carlos Bernier, Doug Bernier, Johnny Barrow, Dale Barra, Yogi Barra, Dennis Barra, Ray Barras, Jose Barrios, Angel Baroa, Herolian Baroa, Freelander Baroa, Stuart Baroa, Barry, Cannonball Barry, Charlie Barry, Claude Barry, Eddie Barry, Joe Barry, Ken Barry, Neil Barry, Quentin Barry, Sean Barry, Tom Barry, Damon Hill, Barry Hill, Frank Bertania, Harry Burt, Dick Bertel, Harry Bertram, John Bertie, Reno, Bertoria, Mike Bertotti, Roman Bertrand, Andres Berumen, Fred Besana, Bob Betcher, Herman Best, Don Descent, Carl Best, William Bestwick, Jim Bestwick, Dallin B. Tenses, Raphael Bentoncourt, Yoon Sky Bentoncourt, Frank Betcher, Wilson Badamill, Christian Bethencourt, Bill Bethia, Jim Beth, Larry Bettencourt, Jeff Bettendorf, Alec Bettinger, Chad Bettis, Betts, Harry Betts, Huck Betts, Mookie Betts, Bruno Betzel, Kurt Beckfoy, Hal Bevan, Bill Beavens, Jason Beverlin, Charlie Beverly, Brian Bevel, Lou Bevel, Ben Bevel, Monty Bevel, Joe Biagiani, Buddy Biansala, Jeff Bianchi, Tommy Blanco, Hank Bisanti, Rainy Ribs, Jim Bibby, Tanner Bibby, Austin Bibbins Dirk, Bo Bichette, Dante Bichette, Phil Bickford, Vern Bickford, Dan Bickman, Charlie Bicknell, Jesse Biddle, Rocky Biddle, Osvaldo Bido, Shane Bieber, Ed Beecher, Brandon Beelock, Oscar Biloski, Mike Bilecki, Harry Bielmer, Lou Bebar, Nick Beerboat, Randor Beard, Charles Bierman, Steve Beeser, Carson Bigby, Lyle Bigby, Larry Bigby, Elliot Bigelow, Hunter Biggie, Caravano Biggio, Craig Biggio, Charlie Biggs, Ivan Bigler, George Bignell, Larry Bittner, Dan Billardo, Jim Bilbrey, Emil Bildillo, Steve Bilko, Harry Billard, Jack Billingham, Bruce Billings, Dick Billings, Josh Billings, Brent Billingsley, Chad Billingsley, Jimmy Binder, Bingo Bingham, George Binks, Vincent, Charlie Bio, Steve Bieroff, Jude Burkall, Doug Bird, Frank Bird, George Bird, Greg Bird, Jake Bird, Kyle Bird, Red Bird, Leo Burdine, David Birdsall, Hayden Birdsong, Mike Birkbeck, Kurt Birkins, Ralph Berkefer, Joe Birmingham, Babe Beerer, Tim Bierstas, Frank Biscan, John Bischoff, Joe Bussiness, Bill Bishop, Brandon Bishop, Charlie Bishop, Frank Bishop, Jim Bishop, Lloyd Bishop, Max Bishop, Mike Bishop, Rivington Baslan, John Basant, Del Basante, Hiram, B. Thorne, Joe Ricker, Jeff Rittinger, Ed Bittman, Spencer Bivens, Jim Biven, Brian Bixler, James George Bjorkman, Ty Block, Black, Bill Black, Bob Black, Bud Black, Dave Black, Don Black, Howard Black, Joe Black, John Black, Mason Black, Ray Black, Tyler Black, Vic Black, Ethan Blackbeach, Blackburn, Charlie Blackburn, Earl Blackburn, George Blackburn, Hugh Blackburn, Jim Blackburn, Nick Blackburn, Paul Blackburn, Ron Blackburn, Lena Blackburn, George Blackburn, Travis Blackley, Charlie Blackman, Cliff Blackman, Henry Blackman, Charlie Blackwell, L.L. Blackwell, Fred Blackwell, Tim Blackwell, Ray Blades, Rick Blade, George Blayholder, Ray Blamier, Aaron Blair, Bill Blair, Buddy Blair, Carson Blair, Clarence Blair, Dennis Blair, Garnet Blair, Lonnie Blair, Paul Blair, Walter Blair, Willie Blair, Dick Blaisdell, Casey Blake, Ed Blake, Frank Blake, Harry Blake, Sheriff Blake, Link Blakely, Rob Blakenston, Bradley Blaylock, Hank Blaylock, Chester Blanchard, Johnny Blanchard, Al Blanc, Andres Blanco, Carlos Blanco, Darian Blanco, Damasco Blanco, Jill Blanco, Gregor Blanco, Roberto Blanco, Henry Blanco, Ossie Blanco, Ronel Blanco, Tony Blanco, Nate Bland, Spike Bland, Fred Blanding, Alex Blanding, Blank, Ronnie Blank, Fred Blank, Matt Blank, Travis Blankenhorn, Cliff Blankenship, Homer Blankenship, Kevin Blankenship, Lance Blankenship, Ted Blankenship, Kyle Blanks, Larvel Blank, Cy Blantoon, Joe Blanton, Javier Blash, Don Blassingham, Wade Blassingham, Steve Blass, Steve Blastrick, Johnny Blatnick, Buddy Blatner, Frank Blatner, Jeff Blauser, Harvey Blauvit, Bob Blaylock, Fred Blaylock, Gary Blaylock, Marv Blaylock, Michael Blazek, Ron Blazier, Larry Bleach, JJ Blade, Bledsoe, Kurt Bleffery, Jeremy Blake, Richard Bleer, Ray Blemker, Ike Blessett, Clarence Blethen, Fox Blevins, Jerry Blevins, Bob Blewett, Scott Blewett, Ned Bly, Elmer Bliss, Frank Bliss, Jack Bliss, Ryan Bliss, Bruno Block, Cy Block, Blocker, Terry Blocker, West Block, Ron Blomberg, Ben Blomdahi, Joe Blong, Jimmy Bloodworth, Bud Bloomfield, Willie Bloomcliff, Jake Bloss, Greg Glosser, Jake Bolt, Mike Blowers, AJ Bluebow, Blue, Bert Blue, Lou Blue, Vita Blue, Aussie Blue, Otto Blue, Jim Blue Jacket, Red Blum, Jeff Blum, Jamie Bluma, Clint Bloom, Bert Blyhaven, Mike Bliska, Lucas Boata, Chet Boak, Charlie Boardman, Frederick Boardman, Randy Bob, Willie Bob, Hiram Baracha, John Bocabella, Mitt Boshek, Bruce Bocci, Doug Boccier, Brett Bokey, Bruce Bocci, Ed Bachman, Randy Bacchus, Brian Bocock, Mike Bodinger, Ping Bodie, Tony Bokel, George Boyer, Joe Bowling, Len Leumer, Brian Loinger, Larry Mummer, Brendan Bosch, Joe Bover, Xander Bogerts, Tim Boger, John Boger, Terry Begner, Brandon Boggs, George Boggs, Mitchell Boggs, Ray Boggs, Tommy Boggs, Wade Boggs, Warren Boggle, Brian Bagushich, Brian Bowen and Pat Bowen, Alec Bowen, Charlie Bowen, TJ Bowen, Sam Bone, Justin Bonnet, Bruce Boyskler, Dan Boitano, Dick Bokelman, Bob Boken, Joe Boykina, Boland, Bernie Boland, Ed Roland, Ronald Boldanos, Charlie Bold, Bolden, Bill Bolden, Stu Bolden, Carl Bowles, Joe Bowley, Jim Bolger, Frank Rollick, Bobby Rowland, Frank Rowland, Jack Rowland, Matt Rowland, Greg Rollo, Dan Bolwig, Mike Bolsinger, Sky Bolton, Cecil Bolton, Cliff Bolton, Colby Bolton, Rod Bolton, Tom Bolton, Mark Baumcock, Ted Bond, Tommy Bond, Walt Bond, Jeremy Bonderman, Barry Bonds, Bob Bonds, Bobby Bonds, George Bond, George Bone, Ricky Bones, Julio Bonetti, Hank Boney, John Bong, Nino Bongioviani, Bill Bonham, Tiny Bonham, Emilio Bonifacio, Jorge Bonifacio, Joe Bonikowski, Bobby Bonilla, Juan Bonilla, Levester Bonilla, Luther Bone, and Eddie Boney, Barry Bonham, Bobby Bonner, Frank Bonner, Robert Bonner, Bill Bones, Gus Bono, Booth Bonzer, Zeke Bonura, Everett Booty Booker, Chris Booker, Greg Booker, Rod Booker, Al Poole, Red Boogles, Aaron Boone, Alonzo Boone, Bob Boone, Brett Boone, Dan Boone, Danny Boone, George Boone, Ike Boone, Lefty Boone, Luke Boone, Oscar Boone, Ray Boone, Cam Boozer, Chris Bootcheck, Booth, Almos Booth, Eddie Booth, Josh Booty, John Boozer, Julie Bourbon, Pedro Bourbon, Joe Borchard, Joe Borchard, George Borges, Frenchie Bordargry, Joe Borden, Pat Borders, Rich Bordy, Mike Bordick, Bill Bordley, Glenn Boardman, Paul Boris, Frank Rourke, Bob Borkowski, Dave Borkowski, Toby Borland, Tom Boland, John Borman, Red Borum, Steve Boros, Joe Borowski, Hank Borough, Babe Borton, Ryan Baruki, JJ Boscon, Wilfredo Boscon, Don Bosch, Rick Bossetti, Buddy Boschers, Chris Bossio, Sean Bosky, Thad Bosley, Dick Bossman, Harley Boss, Mel Bosser, Bostick, Akeem Bostick, Frederick Bostick, Fred Bostick, Henry Bostick, Lyman Bostick, Bob Boston, Daryl Boston, Andy Boswell, Dave Boswell, Ken Boswell, David Booty, Derek Bothello, Ricky Botticillo, John Botterny, Ken Botenfield, Ralph Bowden, Jim Bottomley, Jason Botts, Bob Bott, Sean Bouchard, Ed Bouch, Al Boucher, Dennis Boucher, Medrick Boucher, Lou Bordreau, Carl Boudrin, Jake Boodles, Justin Bohr, Jason Bourgeoisie, Steve Bourgeoisie, uh, Chris Burhus, Peter Burhus, Michael Bourne, Raphael Borginal, James Baroque, Pat Baroque, Caleb Bushley, Jim Boughton, Mike Bovey, Larry Boa, Benny Bocock, Ben Bowden, Michael Bowden, Tim Bowden, Lefty Bow, Chuck Bowen, Cy Bowen, Rob Bowen, Brian Bowen, Sam Bowens, Frankie Bowerman, Billy Bowers, Brent Bowers, Cedric Bowers, Julie Bowers, Lefty Bowers, Shane Bowers, Stu Bowers, Frank Bowes, Jim Bowie, Mika Bowie, and John Boker, and there's more. Jonathan Boland, Grant Bowler, Brian Bowles, Charlie Bowles, Emmett Bowles, Weldon Bowland, Steve Bauman, Abe Bauman, Bill Bauman, Bob Bauman, Bob Bauman, Elmer Bauman, Ernie Bauman, Joe Bauman, Matt Bauman, Roger Bauman, Summer Bauman, Red Bowser, Ted Bousfield, Travis Boyer, Brad Roxenberg, Bill Boyd, Rob Boyd, Eddie Boyd, Frank Boyd, Fred Boyd, Gary Boyd, Jake Boyd, Jason Boyd, Jimmy Boyd, Matthew Boyd, Oil Can Boyd, Ray Boyd, Blaine Boyer, Clate Boyer, Cloud Boyer, Clem Boyer, Doe Boylan, Buzz Boyle, Eddie Boyle, Harry Boyle, Jack Boyle, Jim Boyle, Joe Boyle, Harry Boyles, Marshall Bosey, Gene Brabender, Brad Branch, Silvino Bracco, Gibby Brack, Doc Bracken, Jack Bracken, John Brackenridge, Andrew Brackman, Zach Braddock, Dallas Braden, Don Bradley, Bradford, Bill Bradford, Buddy Bradford, Chad Bradford, Charlie Bradford, Chasen Bradford, Cody Bradford, Larry Bradford, Vic Bradford, Kyle Bradish, Bradley, Al Bradley, Archie Bradley, Brett Bradley, Bill Bradley, Bobby Bradley, Foghorn Bradley, Frankie Bradley, Freddie Bailey, George Bradley, Herb Bradley, Hugh Bradley, Jack Bradley, Jackie Bradley Jr., Jed Bradley, Mark Bradley, Milton Bradley. I saw him play. Phil Bradley, Provine Bradley, Ed Bradley, Ryan Bradley, Scott Bradley, Taj Bradley, Tom Bradley, Dallas Bradshaw, George Bradshaw, Joe Bradshaw, Terry Bradshaw, not the football player, Bill Brady, Bob Brady, Brian Brady, Cliff Brady, Doug Brady, Farmer Brady, Jim Brady, King Brady, Michael Brady, Neil Brady, Spike Brady, Steve Brady, Bobby Bragan, Ramos Baragana, Darren Bragg, Dick Braggins, Glenn Braggs, Dave Brain, Asa Brainerd, Fred Brainerd, Al Braithwaite, Irv Brain, Art Bramall, Ralph Bronca, Al Broncato, Harvey Branch, Norm Branch, Roy Branch, Ron Brand, Mark Brandenburg, Chuck Brandon, Daryl Brandon, Bill Brandt, Ed Brandt, Jackie Brandt, Slim Brandon, George Brannigan, Otis Brandon, Mike Bancock, Dud Branson, Kitty Bransfield, Jeff Branson, Michael Brandt, Cliff Brantley, Jeff Brantley, Michael Brantley, Mickey Brantley, Rob Brantley, Russell Branyan, Matt Brash, Kitty Brashear, Roy Brashear, Ryan Brazier, Joe Batcher, Archie Breathworth, Fred Bratchke, Stephen Brout, John Brown, Ryan Brown, Steve Braun, Rangel Bravo, Garland Braxton, Bill Bray, Buster Bray, James Bray, Ben Bramer, Craig Brazel, Juan Brazelton, Frank Brazel, Al Brazel, Hausker Brazabon, Yensi Brazabon, Leslie Brea, Sid Beam, Jim Briazel, John Brebbia, Harry Brecken, Bill Breckenridge, Brent Beatty, Danny Breeden, Hal Breeden, Mary Breeden, Brees, Alex Bregman, Fred Breening, Alonzo Breitenstein, Theodore Breitenstein, Eugene Bremer, Herb Bremer, Sam Brannigan, Rob Brentley, Ad Brennan, Brendan Brennan, Don Brennan, Jack Brennan, Tom Brennan, Will Brennan, Brilliam Brennan, Jim Brennan, Bart Brenner, Lynn Brenton, Bryce Brents, Jake Brents, Bill Brentzel, Craig Breslow, Roger Branishin, Rube Bressler, Eddie Bressman, Jim Breton, George Brett, Herbert Brett, Ken Brett, Ryan Brett, Mary Brewer, Billy Brewer, Charles Brewer, Chet Brewer, Colton Brewer, Jack Brewer, Jim Brewer, McKinley Brewer, Mike Brewer, Rod Brewer, Sherwood Brewer, Tom Brewer, Tony Brewer, Jamie Brewington, Brewster, Charlie Brewster, Alan Rice, Austin Rice, Jose Braceno, Fred Brickle, Fritz Brickle, George Brickney, Ralph Brickner, Jonah Bride, Jim Bridge, Brideweiser, Marshall Bridges, Rocky Bridges, Tommy Bridges, Al Bridwell, Parker Bridwell, Bunny Brief, Bo Priesky, Bo Brigley, Button Briggs, Charlie Briggs, Dan Briggs, Grant Briggs, John Briggs, Otto Briggs, Jake Brigham, Jeff Brigham, Harry Bright, Joe Bright, Reed Brigg, Nick Nelson, Briles, Greg Biley, Frank Bill, Jill Branhart, Brad Bink, Bill Binkner, Chuck Binkman, Ed Binkman, Leon Brinkoff, Brinson, Louis Brinson, Fatty Briotti, John Briscoe, Lou Brissy, Brandon Bistro, George Bistro, Fernando Brito, Edwio Brito, Joni Brito, Jorge Brito, Juan Brito, Socrates Brito, Tilson Brito, George Britt, Bragg, Jim Britt, Gus Britton, Jack Britton, Chris Britton, Drake Britton, Gil Britton, Jim Britton, John Britton, Zach Britton, Tony Brazzarlo, Johnny Broaka, Broadnex, Lance Broadway, Mike Broadway, Pete Broberg, Doug Brokaw, Chris Brock, Greg Brock, John Brock, Lou Brock, Tarek Brock, King Brockett, Brian Bodenrick, Matt Brodenrick, Steve Brody, Dick Brodowski, Connor Brogdon, Ernie Brogolio, Rick Brogna, Jake Brohammer, Tony Browen, Ken Bondel, Jeff Bronke, Herman Bronkel, Bronson, Jim Bronstead, Ike Brookins, Tom Brookins, Brooks, Aaron Brooks, Emil Brooks, Bobby Brooks, Frank Brooks, Hubie Brooks, Irvin Brooks, Jerry Brooks, Jess Brooks, Joe Brooks, Mandy Brooks, Sidney Brooks, Chenton Brooks, J.B. Broom, Alex Broom, Scott Brosius, Sig Broski, Jim Brosman, Terry Bros, Frank Brosio, Mike Brosio, Rex Brothers, Tony Broughton, Carl Broughton, Mark Brohard, Bren Broussard, Art Brothers, Dan Brothers, Joe Brovia, Scott Brow, Bob Brower, Frank Brower, Jim Brower, Luis Brower, Brown, Adrian Brown, Alton Brown, Andrew Brown, B. Brown, B.L. Brown, Barney Brown, Ben Brown, Benny Brown, Bill Brown, Bob Brown, Bobby Brown, Brant Brown, Books Brown, Buster Brown, Carol Brown, Charlie Brown, Chris Brown, Clarence Brown, Clint Brown, Corey Brown, Country Brown, Curly Brown, Kurt Brown, Curtis Brown, Daryl Brown, Dave Brown, D. Brown, Delos Brown, Dick Brown, Dominic Brown, Drummond Brown, Dusty Brown, Earl Brown, Ed Brown, Eddie Brown, Elmer Brown, Emil Brown, Fed Brown, Gary Brown, Gates Brown, George Brown, Hal Brown, Hunter Brown, Ike Brown, Jay Brown, Jackie Brown, Jake Brown, James Brown, Jamie Brown, Jarvis Brown, Jeremy Brown, Jeremy Brown, Jesse Brown, Jim Brown, Jimmy Brown, Joe Brown, John Brown, Joe Furby Brown, Jordan Brown, Jumbo Brown, Keith Brown, Kevin Brown, Larry Brown, Leon Brown, Lou Brown, Lindsey Brown, Lloyd Brown, Mace Brown, Mark Brown, Marty Brown, Matthew Brown, Maywood Brown, Mike Brown, Mordecai Brown, Merrill Brown, Norm Brown, Oliver Brown, Ollie Brown, Oscar Brown, Ossie Brown, Paul Brown, Randy Brown, Ray Brown, Hall of Famer, Robert Brown, Ronnie Brown, Roosevelt Brown, Sam Brown, Scott Brown, Scrappy Brown, Seth Brown, Steve Brown, Stub Brown, TJ Brown, Ted Brown, Tom Brown, Tommy Brown, Trevor Brown, Walter Brown, Willard Brown, Hall of Famer, William Brown, Brian Brownie, Earl Brownie, George Brown, Jerry Brown, Pidge Brown, Barrett Browning, Carl Browning, Frank Browning, Pete Browning, Tom Browning, Mark Brownson, Jonathan Broxton, Keon Boxton, Broyles, Bill Brubaker, Bruce Ray, Brubaker, J.T. Brubaker, Bob Bruce, Clarence Bruce, Jay Bruce, Lloyd Bruce, Lou Bruce, Fred Buckbauer, Earl Bucker, Earl Brooker, Andy Bruckmiller, J.T. Bruette, Frank Rugi, Jacob Brugman, Mike Burhart, Justin Brewy, Vidal Berhan, Cliff Birnbaugh, Jacob Brumfield, Duff Brumley, Mike Brumley, Glenn Brummer, Greg Bermott, Tyson Brummett, Tom Ronaski, Jack Brunner, Roy Brunner, George Brunette, Justin Brunette, Brian Burney, Tom Bruno, Arlo Brusenberg, Will Brunson, Eric Brunette, Bob Bush, Jim Brewski, Warren Brewstar, Bill Bruton, Jack Bruton, Ed Bruviette, Billy Bryan, Alan Bryan, Clay Bryan, Derek Bryan, Don Bryan, Chris Bryan, R.P. Bryant, Ralph Bryant, Ron Bryant, T.R. Biden, Steve Byer, Todd Byron, Zach Breiser, Jamie Rubella, Chris Rubik, Hal Boopser, Johnny Buca, Bob Buchanan, Brian Buchanan, Chess Buchanan, David Buchanan, Jake Buchanan, Jim Buchanan, Jerry Butrick, Jim Butcher, Clay Buchholz, Taylor Buchholz, Ryan Butcher, John Buck, Travis Book, Gary Buckles, Garland Buckeye, Fred Buckingham, Jess Buckles, Dick Buckley, John Buckley, Kevin Buckley, Bill Buckner, Billy Buckner, Mark Baduska, Jay Budd, Ryan Budd, Mike Buddy, Don Budding, Mike Budnick, Mark Budzinski, Steve Buchel, Walter Bueller, Mark Bueller, Charlie Bulow, Fritz Bulow, Francisco Bueno, Jay Buento, Art Buenas, Charlie Buffington, Damon Buford, Dan Buford, James Buford, Bob Buell, Jay Buhner, D1 Buse, J.B. Bucox, Cy Bucher, Henry Bucher, Ryan Bukovich, Jason Bolger, George Bullard, Sim Bullis, Scott Bullock, Terry Bulling, Jim Bullinger, Kurt Bullinger, Ryan Bullington, Eric Bullock, Red Bullock, Al Bunbury, Madison Baumgardner, Aaron Bummer, Nate Bump, Earl Bumpus, Josh Bunsey, Melvin Bunch, Dylan Bundy, Wally Bunker, Willie Run, Jim Bunning, Danny Barad, Dave Barba, Bill Burbick, Buddy Burbage, Burbank, Nelson Burbank, Al Birch, Ernie Birch, Walter Birch, Larry Burchard, Fred Burchell, Bob Berta, Freddie Burdett, Lou Burdett, Nick Birdie, Zach Birdies, Bill Burdick, Peyton Burdick, Jack Burdick, Joe Berg, Bergen, Jake Berger, P. Burgess, Smokey Burgess, Tom Burgess, P. Burgett, Ralph Bergen, Tom Bergmeyer, Bill Rugo, Ambiorx Burgos, Enrique Burgos, Huron Rugos, Raymond Burgos, Bill Bunch, Mark Burke, Sandy Burke, Chauncey Burkman, Elmer Burkhart, Billy Burke, Bobby Burke, Brock Burke, Chris Burke, Dan Burke, Eddie Burke, Ernest Burke, Frank Burke, Glenn Burke, Craig Burke, James Burke, Jamie Burke, Jamie Burke, Joe Burke, John Burke, Leo Burke, Mike Burke, Pat Burke, Sean Burke, Steve Burke, Tim Burke, Colleen Burke. What? That's a different. William Burke, Jesse Burkett, John Burkett, Ken Burkhart, Matthew Burkhart, Liz Burks, Alec Burleson, Rick Burleson, Corbin Burns, AJ Burnett, Alex Burnett, Hercules Burnett, Johnny Burnett, Sean Burnett, Tex Runett, Wally Burnett, Willie Burnham, Jerome Burmitz, Andy Burns, Bill Burns, Billy Burns, Britt Burns, C.B. Burns, Corey Burns, Dennis Burns, Dick Burns, Ed Burns, Farmer Burns, George Burns, Jack Burns, Jim Burns, Joe Burns, John Burns, Joseph Burns, Mike Burns, Thomas Burns, Todd Burns, Tom Burns, Willie Burns, Pete Burnside, Sheldon Burnside, George Burpo, Ryan Burr, Tom Burr, Frank Burrell, Harry Burrell, Pat Burrell, Brian Burris, Larry Gowright, Al Burris, Paul Burris, Ray Burris, Samuel Burris, Emmanuel Burris, Henry Burrows, Jeff Burrows, Sean Burrows, Bo Burrows, John Burrows, Mike Burrows, Terry Burrows, Dick Burris, Frank Burt, Dick Burton, Ellis Burton, Jared Burton, Jim Burton, Sammy Burton, Mo Burtsby, Dennis Burt, Bill Burwell, Dick Burwell, Jim Boosby, Mike Busby, Paul Busby, Steve Busby, Ed Bush, Michael Bush, Mike Bush, Brian Busher, Don Bushhorn, Matt Bushman, Alan Bussiness, Bullet Joe Bush, Dave Bush, Donnie Bush, Guy Bush, Homer Bush, Kai Bush, Matt Bush, Randy Bush, Jake Bushelum, Frank Bushy, Chris Bushing, Doc Bouchon, Joe Busky, Mike Busky, Tom Busky, Nick Buss, Ray Buss, Herbert Buster, Hank Butcher, John Butcher, Max Butcher, Mike Butcher, Drew Butler, Sal Budura, Ed Budka, Bill Bootland Butler, Adam Butler, Art Butler, Bill Butler, Billy Butler, Brent Butler, Brett Butler, Cecil Butler, Charlie Butler, Dan Butler, Dick Butler, Ed Butler, Eddie Butler, Frankie Butler, Ike Butler, Joey Butler, John Butler, Johnny Butler, Josh Butler, Keith Butler, Kid Butler, Lawrence Butler, Rich Butler, Rob Butler, Tom Butler, Frank Buttery, Jose Buteau, Ty Buttrey, Tommy Butts, Brian Buxton, Ralph Buxton, Joe Boozas, John Boozart, Chubby Rias, Bud Byerly, Bill Byers, Randy Byers, Freddie Bynum, Mike Bynum, Bill Bird, Harry Bird, Jeff Bird, Jim Bird, Marlon Bird, Ollie Bird, Paul Bird, Samuel Bird, Tim Burdick, Bobby Byrne, Jerry Byrne, Tommy Byrne, Eric Burns, Jim Burns, Mitt Burns, Cyril Burns, and Marty Burnstrom. That's been your every Major League Baseball player as of May 17th, 2025, whose last name started with the letter B. Tomorrow we'll have the letter C, which has 1,798 players, so that'll be fun. And again, thank you for tuning into the videos. Don't forget that you can also see me on Patreon at Sammy5436, where it's $1 a month. I also am seeable on Instagram at Sammy5436. What?
TikTok at Sammy5436. I'm on Blue Sky at Sammy5436, though I don't use that often. I believe I'm on Tumblr at Sammy5436, but I haven't used that in at least a year. And you can find me at my business email, thetrapezoidtalks5436 at gmail.com. Any information you need to send to those business emails will be looked at. I generally look at my business email on Wednesdays and Sundays, so just do be advised that I do not always have the ability to respond immediately, but if you do send an email to my business email, and as long as it's not offensive, I will respond if it's something I'm interested in with something positive, and if it's something I'm not interested in, I will thank you for your email and go ahead and say that there may be a future opportunity for us to collaborate if that's something you're interested in.